welcome, everyone. It's so lovely to see you. Thank you for being here for tonight's masterclass, or it may not be tonight for you. It may be morning or afternoon or even the middle of the night, but thank you so much for being here. I'm Morag. I'm here for the Permaculture Education Institute. And tonight we have a very special guest joining us for our masterclass series. So for those of you who this is the very first time of joining us in these sessions, we run a monthly masterclass, a free monthly masterclass, bringing to you a topic that is of real importance to focus on, and something that could be either deeply embedded within the world of permaculture, or something that embraces the world of permaculture, or something that sits beside the world of permaculture. So I'm so glad that you're here. If you wouldn't mind, for the first part, keeping your mics off, and I'm just going to press the mute all button. So if you wouldn't mind just keeping it muted while the first part of this session happens. In the second part, we're going to open up the mic and you'll be able to ask questions. And if you feel like doing that, you can use the chat button below to put your hand up, or if you feel it's more comfortable to write it in the sort of the chat, you can do that and we'll ask the question to Helena as well. So I'd like to now open tonight's session. This is the 42nd monthly masterclass that we've been running here. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm seated here today. I'm here on the land of the Gubbi Gubbi, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I have a great pleasure of welcoming Helena Norberg-Hodge to join me here today. Now, Helena is a catalyst for local food projects around the world and has been doing this work for decades. In fact, Helena's work in localization has been what has inspired me deeply from when I first met her 30 years ago to dive so deeply into permaculture as a way of applying how I knew how to apply the kind of ideas that she talked about when I was just forming my ideas around this. And it was an absolute pleasure to spend the weekend with her just past, and to see how much she inspires so many people. We were walking down the street together, and just about every person that saw you stopped to have a chat about these things. You know, people really resonate with what you talk about, Helena, because it makes sense. It just makes such good sense. And so this event tonight is around, it's a celebration of an event that Helena has been hosting called World Localization Day. And this session is a focus on how to activate your local food community. So a couple more introduction points. So Helena, if you haven't already seen her film Planet Local, A Quiet Revolution, which was launched last week, I encourage you to do that. We'll send you the link for that. She is also the director and the producer of an award-winning film called The Economics of Happiness. And of course, she also was the producer of the Ancient Futures film, which came out in the 1990s, and along with her book that has become an absolute classic, Ancient Futures. She's also the recipient of Right Livelihood Award, a Goy Peace Award. So what I think that Helena brings to this conversation today is such a depth of experience and perspective that can help us to understand why and what and how we need to be focusing on localization of our food system and how we can build local food communities. So welcome, Helena. It is such a delight to have you here today.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here and thrilled to be collaborating with you.
So, add a spotlight. There we go. So I just wanted to maybe begin with an opening question around what is World Localization Day, and why do you focus on food as the heart of this process of localization?
Well, World Localization Day is our attempt to raise awareness about these amazing and really inspirational efforts going on around the world that are about rebuilding our community connections. It's about rebuilding human-scale local economies. People aren't necessarily always thinking of it that way because they haven't necessarily studied the global economy the way that I and my network have. So they may not be focusing on local as an important defining characteristics. But when you look around the world, you will find that from the bottom up, people on every continent are showing their desire to have a better relationship with one another, to have deeper connections, human scale connection, and a better relationship with nature. So quite spontaneously, they're actually going in the opposite direction of the dominant economic path, which really from the outset has been in support of global traders and global trade. And it's actually been really from the beginning destroying local economies. As we decided to highlight this with the name World Localization Day, we did that actually because of COVID. Before that, we had been highlighting these local initiatives by organizing regional conferences around the world. We had found that our film, The Economics of Happiness, was being used worldwide in about 20 languages to raise awareness and to get more of these localization efforts going. And then we started building on that by organizing regional conferences where we brought in some of the experts in the world about localization. And central to that is permaculture. At the very heart of it is the reconnection to the land as the real economy. And there is nothing as important as food. There's nothing else that people produce that every single person on the planet needs every day. So we need to be really clear about the fact that our government policies, including how things are taxed, how they are subsidized, what the regulations are, they are actually supporting that we are further and further removed from the sources of our food, that we are actually day by day locked into a system that is the biggest contributor to climate change, to mountains of plastic, and structurally to bigger and bigger monocultures. The monocultures cannot produce as much food per acre, whereas diversified systems can produce between 5 and actually even 20 times more food per unit of land. So it's a long answer, but food is at the center, and we'll talk more about that. And that's why for us, the permaculture movement is so central and important in this worldwide localization movement. I think I answered most of your
Thank
question.
you. That was a very beautiful answer. And I wanted then to also ask if you could describe what you see as a local food community, because as to contrast what you're talking about, the global food system to the local food community. How can you describe what it is and what the difference is?
Well, fundamental is that when the distance between the farm and the community that needs that food is not so vast, the market stimulates and actually demands diversity. So in the modern industrialized world, where we've been separated further and further, farmers have been encouraged to do bigger and bigger monocultures for more and more distant markets, ultimately driven by global corporations, global investment, and global trade arrangement. In that system, as I said, you're getting less productivity because it's a monoculture. You're killing the soil. There is nothing in nature that is monocultural. It's anti-life. And when you have just one thing, whether it's soybeans or sugarcane or macadamia nuts, you're so vulnerable. So you're condemned virtually to using fungicides, herbicides, pesticides, because it's so unnatural. You're also so vulnerable to a hailstorm, to wind, to drought, to wet, because you don't have the diversity that makes you so-called more resilient. I'm a bit resistant to that word. I feel it's being overused. But anyway, the diversification does lead to greater resilience, to much more flexibility and survival potential in this very precarious world. So what we mean when we talk about local food economies, local food systems, local food communities is, first of all, what you found in most traditional economies in the world before slavery, before genocide, the 4 enclosures in Europe where the elites pushed people away from the land, prevented them from having a land where they could produce for their needs. And they were always, of course, producing a range of things. Nowhere in the world would anyone think of, we're just going to produce sugarcane, or we're just going to produce tea or oats or whatever it might be. There was a range of things for people's needs. And of course, this included animals in the cycle that gave very valuable fertilizer, that provided labor, that provided leather, and that also were part of the community. People actually related deeply to their animals in a completely different way from this factory farming, which is the most obscene, monstrous aspect of this modern industrial corporate system. So in those local food communities, I experienced this very closely in a place called Ladakh and in Bhutan. And that's what inspired me to start all this work from the mid-70s. And that's where I met, well, no, I met you in England, but you came out later to Ladakh. But so I basically saw these local food communities in the traditional cultures, and then started to encourage the starting up of new farmers markets, of community-supported agriculture, various ways for communities to connect to food production. And of course, permaculture is a system that brings it very closely because it encourages people to start growing their own food. So that again is a little bit of a picture, I hope.
You know, something that is really central to local food communities as well is that it's about food first, whereas the other system is about export first. So I think that is kind of a key point as well. And I just wanted to ask you a little bit about song. We talked about singing over the weekend, and I was taken to remember working in the fields, in Ladakhi fields, and every single aspect had a song. Like as you were harvesting the grain, there was a song that was kind of in a way encouraging people to keep going because it was a bit hard work, you know, doing the grain harvesting. And then there was another one for singing thanks to the zoos, the yak cows, for helping in the and there was another one that was a whistle for when you were threshing the grain because you didn't want to suck in the chaff. So can you talk a little bit about the power of song in a local community or local food community?
Well, again, it's something I hope we can bring back. It is coming back in the modern new local, which I also think of as a type of re-indigenization. But in those traditional cultures, and particularly in Ladakh, where I learned to speak the language fluently, and I lived with the people, well, over a 40-year period, actually, in the early years for about half of the year. And it took me quite a while to realize how many aspects to a whole way of life where people were embedded in nature. The culture was shaped by the dictates of nature. It was a high altitude desert and they had to manage the water very carefully, etc. Very cold. So they had quite large houses that were made of adobe brick, and all of that deep adaptation to nature provided essentially, or created a culture that was also, I would say, more feminine. Women and the feminine had a very strong role. It was overall participatory instead of competitive, collaborative. It was one where you could say, I know you've heard the term, it takes a village to raise a child. Well, I discovered that really it takes a village to harvest a field, to plant a field, to build a house. And that's what people had. And not only did they have all these people coming together to do all these things, but yes, they sang. And over the years, I came to realize that the singing actually is both meditative, it's also physically beneficial because I think it affects your breath. And it's a way of coming together in a deep sense of oneness. You know, when we sing a note together, it's a coming together that is almost unique in all of human experience. We can dance together and so on, but to actually hit a tone together in that way is a deep spiritual experience of oneness, of deep connectedness. And as you were saying, Morag, it was wonderful to see that there were these different songs, and a lot of them were so charming because they were singing to the animals and saying, you know, we know this is hard work, but soon you'll be able to go back up to the high pastures and you'll be able to relax. But now, please work as hard as you can for us. And then, yeah, I remember writing to Western friends one summer, and then I suddenly realized how crazy it was, because I was literally writing, this summer was particularly enjoyable because there was construction going on our house. And then as I finished that, I realized how that would sound in the West. And I was going on to explain that because of the construction on the house, as people were carrying mud bricks up on the third floor, they were singing different types of song to do with building. And this was going on at the same time as there was literally a range of songs in the field, including the whistling that Morag mentioned with the winnowing. And at the same time, because it was harvest time, there were monks in the chapel in the house, and they were using these amazing instruments, long horns and drums and this conch shell, and chanting. So it was like this amazing chorus of different forms of song and chanting. And yeah.
I remember hearing that I was sitting up in the top of the valley in Tia, in the village of Tia, and you could hear the song where different people were adding their stage of farming up and down the valley, because you could hear what song they were singing. And I noticed, you know, that the cows were going, the zoes were going from one farm to another farm. And there was a sense of community. Not everyone had all of everything, that it happened because there was a community sharing about it. And at the end, everyone came together and had a big celebration, a feast for it. And that went on for quite some time, I remember.
That's right. Even at the peak working season, the harvest was probably the peak, because at the time of the harvest, there's the danger that it's going to start snowing and it could destroy the crops. So it's quite time sensitive. But even then, I realized that people were having picnics in the middle of the day. And again, at this very leisurely pace, at a human pace, not at the pace of a machine. I know it sounds too romantic. I know it's hard to believe, because the picture I'm painting here is a picture that has been completely negated by a lot, I would say, a lot of propaganda, which has come from the elites who benefit by driving us away from self-reliance. Over the years, I also came to realize that driving people away from self-reliance was accompanied by terrible psychological pressures that destroyed self-respect, both individual self-respect and community self-respect, cultural self-respect. So this is another issue that I think today more than ever we need to be very aware of, that the people who work the land, even in the West, are still considered inferior to the doctors and the professors and the lawyers and the engineers. But in places like China and India now and Ladakh, the idea is that you must do everything you can to get your child to school so they can become an engineer or a doctor and move into the city, leave farming, which is useless and primitive. And it's a disaster. And so raising the status of farming is one of the most important things we can do. Again, it's something that permaculture has been doing in a very effective way. And there are now lots of young people, and not only young people, who want to farm. I'd like to add that living in that ancient nature-based indigenous culture also made me aware that the two most important things we do as human beings, how we rear our children and how we rear our food. And remember, the food is linked to how we get the fiber for clothing, the building materials for our houses, so all basic needs, how we interact with the land, primary production. Those have all been turned into unimportant sort of shadow type work. So right at the center now, we need to bring back that respect for how we rear our children and how we rear our food and other primary production.
So the lessons that you learned by being embedded in a place like Ladakh and other communities that you visited is something that you brought back home, and it's something that I was inspired to bring back home too, and create things like city farms, community gardens, food cooperatives, and really ripple out those types of programs. And so that's something that you've been advocating ever since as well. And I wonder if you could share with us perhaps some examples of how you've been able to help support, activate these local food communities back in the West.
Well, in a multitude of ways, but I would like to say that even in the beginning, when I first had my eyes open to this, which was entirely because of Ladakh and Bhutan, I went back to the West just basically with an educational message, because I had seen that in those cultures, food that had been transported for weeks over roads using lots of fossil fuels was delivered in the local market at half the price of local food. And the most striking thing in Ladakh was butter, because butter was a very important part of the diet. They had very rich and nutritious butter from their local animals that were able to graze on their high pastures. And now suddenly here was this butter delivered literally at half the price of butter from a 5-minute walk away.
And it was rancid, I remember.
It was rancid. And I learned later that it contained formaldehyde to prevent it from becoming even more rancid, which is, of course, toxic to our health. But it's not just that, it's all the fumes of the transport. We do not have full statistics, but I can tell you from all the statistics that we've gathered and all our studies that the global food system in its totality, without a doubt, is the biggest contributor to climate change, to toxic pollution, to the mountains of plastic, and to most of the serious health issues we have, including heart disease, diabetes, but also cancer. The pesticides, the fungicides. I have worked with scientists around the world since the 70s, and their research show without any doubt that this is the biggest contributor. But we don't get to hear enough about that because our science has been more and more funded by big business. So we've got to really look for the research that is not funded by big corporate entities filled with very nice people. It's not some evil conscious conspiracy. That structurally, these global corporations that are funding that research, that are funding the development of new chemicals, new genetic engineering, new pesticides, fungicides, etc., their number one reason for existence is profit. And there's no way you can get around that. So we do need to be looking for how we can support science in the public interest, how we can get honest research. So having seen this and trying to raise awareness about it in the West, I accompanied with that clear description of how the global food system, which was becoming more and more funded, more and more supported through trade treaties, particularly since the mid-80s, how dangerous this was and how it was taking us down this path of creating even more climate problems, more health problems, etc. And we started promoting the local. So mainly we did that by writing books. We created a local food sort of activist toolkit that gave people a slideshow. I'm trying to remember, a little booklet. We did books. We did a book called From the Ground Up, Rethinking Industrial Agriculture. Later on, we did a book called Bringing the Food Economy Home. And we started doing also little films, conferences. We had international conferences.
And a study circle.
And study circles, yes. We still encourage people to do that. That's right. We encourage people to come together in their local areas to rethink these issues, because there are a lot of basic assumptions we need to rethink. And today, more than ever, I would urge people to come together in local groups, not just to rethink, but also to reconnect more deeply. We become so separated from one another, and we're so fearful of being honest about our problems, about our deeper worries, about our flaws. We become so protected, and we've been trained into a system where we believe from childhood onwards that unless we're perfect, we're not going to be loved. And it's when people come together and are able to talk openly about their deepest fears, their deepest concerns, and still feel appreciated, heard, and loved, they belong, that people start becoming more human again, becoming more self-compassionate, and through that, more compassionate for others. So it's a very, very important thing, this coming together in local groups. What we also did was we started, I'm trying to think what the very first practical thing I remember in Bristol in the UK, where we were for part of the year, we started at the first local food program in England. And it started with a little booklet that was about connecting producers and consumers. It started by the first practical implementation was to have local producers deliver a box at a school. And so this was called a box scheme where people could pick it up there. Later on, they were picking it up at my assistant's home in Bristol for probably about a year. Those boxes were collected there. And then the next step, I think, from that was we helped to start the first new farmers market. And that was actually in Bath, near to Bristol. And the farmers market went so well that we started particularly promoting farmers markets around the world. And we did that all throughout the US. We did it, I went to the Czech Republic, I don't know, all kinds of countries, Japan, Korea, and then later on Australia in 2000. And it's remarkable to see how much this local food movement has grown. It's so heartening, because I know more than anybody that these initiatives have not been supported by government. They've not had support from the mainstream media. They've not been supported by mainstream academia. It's been sort of blood, sweat, and tears from the bottom up. It's been people like Morag and me who've been willing to do things more or less on a voluntary basis. And in fact, around the world, I see that it's a movement absolutely led by women. These small human scale local food initiatives around the world, absolutely the majority have been initiated by women. It's even been often like a farmer's wife. One of them, I remember in Devon, her husband was near suicide because small farmers have continued to be marginalized, underfunded, struggling. As one farmer in Australia said to me, until we started the farmers market, he'd grown up as a farmer and his whole life he had felt like a serf. Whereas when we started the farmers market, he said it was like entering another galaxy. Now suddenly he was talking to the people who appreciated his food. They didn't mind a few specks on the avocados or the bananas because they knew it hadn't been sprayed. They didn't need to have everything a standard size. You see, the supermarket already cannot deal with nature, which is diversity. Every avocado is not the same size. And that means tons of food is being dumped because the machinery, the technology, the standardization for the monoculture, even in the marketing, means that we're burning tons of food. It's a hideous system. Not the people, they're not evil. People inside that system often think it's the only way. They believe the propaganda that we need bigger to feed the world and that all these small things are just nice little projects for the elite. It's because they don't have enough information, particularly about the so-called third world. But so it's a movement led by women, and it is incredibly inspiring to know that it is growing despite the lack of support. That I hope all of you who listen, I can see, I'm looking here at my screen, I see Jennifer, Natalie, Sylvia, Gabriella, Sandy, and Susan. all women, as it happens right now at the top of my screen. And I think probably a very large number of you listeners are women. And really, we must speak out more. We must come together more and stick to what we know in our gut, in our soul, is the right way to go.
Helena, I wanted to just bring that point that you made about that it's often seen as being something that's an elite thing. And maybe if you could just talk to that a bit, because I heard you saying at the local food feast the other day about, La Via Campesina being this, one of the world's biggest movements, and no one ever hears about it. That going towards local food systems is not an elitist thing. So could you just speak a bit more about that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. It's maybe one of the most important messages that we need to get out there in a multitude of ways. So as I was saying earlier, I saw how butter that had been transported for weeks, full of chemicals, etc., was delivered in the local market for half the price of local butter. I then happened to do surveys because I was invited around the world, particularly after I had written the book Ancient Futures, which was translated into almost 50 languages. We've lost track of some of them, but so I was invited to Mongolia, to Kenya, and was in touch with people around the world. Also from Myanmar, they translated my book and snuck it in illegally. But anyway, I started looking at this, and I found that in Mongolia, where they had 25 million milk-producing animals, like milk and cream and butter was basically a staple, like in Ladakh and Tibet. And yet in the main city of Ulaanbaatar, you couldn't even find Mongolian products. They were from Germany. By the way, in Mongolia at that time, I was also served water bottled by Coca-Cola in Hong Kong. This is at a time when most of the water in Mongolia would have been purer than anything you can imagine. I mean, it's just absolutely insane. In Kenya, the butter in the market was from Holland, and again, it cost half the price of the local. And then I went back to England, and I found that butter from New Zealand, in Devon and Cornwall, where they're famous for their dairy and produce excellent butter and cream. Again, this butter from the other side of the world was regularly costing about half of the local. So, first of all, when you then try to reestablish a local food economy, a local food community, and your local producers need to charge what they need to do to survive, it will generally be more than these artificially low prices. That's how big business keeps pushing the idea that this is elitist. What we don't hear is that it's extremely elitist of our governments to be subsidizing global corporations and global trade, that they are subsidizing giants that are extracting billions while destroying literally billions of farmers, billions, because when we look at what's going on in China and India, that's what you'll see. So what's happening is that hidden subsidies, as well as direct subsidies, have always been a way of subsidizing the big traders. So already in the 80s, when we were looking at this in America, we found that the government subsidies for wheat, for instance, they weren't benefiting the consumer or the farmer. They were benefiting Kellogg's that was buying artificially cheap wheat to turn it into cereal to sell to the public. These are just some examples, but I also want to add that at the local level, there is a lot of over-regulation. And that over-regulation comes from big business pressuring government to bring in regulations in order to destroy the small competitors. Again, it makes them sound quite evil, but it's not. Remember, these corporations are not individuals. They're like a huge country often. They're often wealthier than whole countries, and they employ, sometimes millions of people, and certainly many, many thousands, and they're all very specialized. So, of course, they're going to try to compete, and they have a very easy job because at the local and even national level, regulations weigh heavily on everyone. But at the global level, trade treaties are about free trade. They're about freedom for global corporations, no rules. And even worse than that, the corporations are actually now forcing governments to sign that they won't do anything to reduce their profits. So they can't protect the environment, they can't protect labor, or they'll be taken to court. So this is a truth that's out in the open, but it's one of these sort of strange things of being sort of a secret because no one pays attention, because the global seems so far away, and people at the local level who are suffering from all of this don't feel that they're equipped to study the global. And this is what I really hope that, Morag, you and I will collaborate more in Australia to try to get particularly more women to look at these basic principles. The last thing you want to do is study economics. Economics trains you into false assumptions about nature and about human nature. We are taught that we're innately greedy and competitive. We're taught that there is this somehow natural economies of scale. It's complete rubbish. The economies of scale are a myth when it comes to any of the primary production. Anything that is about getting some wood for building or food from the ground, managing water, economies of scale are basically the opposite of what we're told. Almost to the point where the smaller the better, the more labor the better, the more people, the more eyes, hearts, and hands per acre. That way we can get more from nature while with care and love, more higher productivity. So yeah, very long-winded.
No, that's absolutely beautiful, Helen. And what I wanted to ask with you following on from that then, so once people start to gather their local food communities together and start thinking about how they might manifest that in their own community, what are some of the ways that they could possibly then have agency to address these global issues as well? Because this is something that you often talk about. It's not just enough to kind of look locally, but how can we be looking locally and globally and put pressure? Like, is there a way that we can, as local community food systems, put pressure on government, on these corporations? Or is it just a matter of being so strong and myceliating our projects in a way that we have this groundswell that shifts things? What do you say about that?
Yeah, I would argue that I would urge almost everybody to try to get involved with some of these local projects, but try to remember that it's not just about shopping at the farmers market. I mean, very often I've said I almost prefer that if your farmers market is far away and it's, very inconvenient, or if you feel you can't afford the food there, I would rather that you would think of volunteering for maybe a few hours a week to support a local food system to be created, come together with others, maybe to start a new farmers market or a local food shop, or make sure that at the school they're getting local fresh food. There are many different ways that you can actually be involved in the hands-on local food initiative. And once you're really clear that this is the best thing you can do in terms of climate, mountains of plastic, illness, etc., and you start being aware of how healing it is for you and for others to be connected in that way to community members, but over soil, over land, over seeds, over being engaged with this amazing miracle of life, the constant change, the miraculous development where you think at times in nature, you just feel like you can have your cake and eat it too, because you get such a proliferation and you just can't believe it. And other times it can be hard, but once you're engaged in that way, it's deeply spiritually and psychologically healing. So once you see how it's a sort of economics of happiness, you can see there's a path forward that is actually about personal healing and healing the planet. So that in itself is very empowering. However, we would ask you to also join community initiatives that will devote some effort to some kind of educational process to get this bigger picture out. The big picture about why small, local, human scale, slower, diversified is so essential to counter the propaganda about economies of scale, about the global being necessary, high tech, AI, high rise agriculture. You'll start seeing there's a package of ideas that are in support of corporate profit that now overall is making a handful of people, it seems, into billionaires or trillionaires, while the average person is working harder than ever before. So even the truth that the middle class are having to work longer and harder just to pay the rent, just to pay for energy and food on the table, this is now the reality in America, in England, in Australia. But we're not yet really being told that by the media, but I think we can feel it. So part of what we need to do is to articulate and share that bigger picture. And I do want to say that our materials, the Economics of Happiness, Planet Local, World Localization Day, our Localization Action Guide, some of those can be used as part of the educational process. Because in order to change the policies, I would argue that right now, trying to write to your member of parliament or to even in the local council, I would say you're going to be better off trying to build a bit of that mycelial, as Morag was saying, spread across to people who care about climate, people who are worried about the epidemic of depression among young people who are worried about the increase in cancer, people who are worried about the loss of democracy, about plastic, and so many worries. But once you see the bigger picture, you can see how we can come together with a joint message. And that joint message then we will use to start pressure for a new politics. But it must go beyond left and right. It's got to go beyond even what green has become now, in order to be very clear that we have an emergency in terms of human well-being and ecological well-being. And we have a solution, which is a systemic path towards supporting the local instead of the global that benefits both people and nature. So right now, just the green label can still alienate some people, farmers, small business people who are really struggling to survive. And they will then see the green as, concerned more about the frogs and the koalas, and no one cares about Mike going bankrupt. So we need a new narrative, a new story about the new economic path that will create thriving local economies, thriving local and even national businesses, even including international trade. But it's a fundamental structural difference between the localizing path and the globalizing path. So I hope that makes sense.
So thank you, Helena. Well, I'd like to invite people to put forward some questions for you now, if that's okay.
Sure.
What I might do is, if you'd like to put your hand up, down below there is a little reactions button where you can do this. You can raise your hand and it pops you up into the top corner. If you want to do that, that's a good way to sort of see who wants to ask questions. I'll also be scanning through the chat for some questions too. I would just like to invite you to really frame what you're saying as a question as quickly as possible, because we've got about 15 minutes left and I know there'd be many things that people want to say. So rather than sort of big, long explanations, as much as we'd love to hear about your stories, perhaps we can at a later date organize a sort of a cross-pollination session where we can come together and talk about what we're all doing. So great. Okay, so what I'm going to do is invite you, Martha, to open your mic and, if you can, your camera too, to come and say hello.
Hello, thank you. It's wonderful to be here and to see such a huge turnout of people. My question is, I come from textiles and I still am longing to hear Fibres being brought in. So whether it's animal fibers, from sheep and goats and things, but primarily flax, hemp, nettles, which can be really great for healing soil, bringing nutrients in. So what are your thoughts on that? And please, can we talk fibers in with food?
Yeah, absolutely. I just do want to stress though that the food issue is more of a dramatic need. Whereas, all of us could manage with all the clothes we have. If there is a climate disaster, we could all manage. Whereas food will be out of the supermarket within 3 days. So I would love it if you, with your fiber, would include food as part of it. So ideally, include a mixed system where the hemp or the flax or the animal fibers could be part of also a food productive cycle. Because again, in the healthy localized system, it was food, fiber, building materials all together. And that's what created the most incredibly productive systems. So yeah, absolutely. Very important. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Martha. Scotty, welcome. How are you today?
I'm good. And yourself?
Really good.
Excellent. Good day, Helena. Look, there's been a bit of a conversation going on in the chat about what is it? It's the results of patriarchy, basically. How have you seen the First Nations people all over the world that you've visited? How have the genders related there, and how does that relate to what we have?
Well, this is quite a complicated issue, and I hope people will look at or read my book, Ancient Futures, because on the surface, when I was faced with anthropologists who were coming in to Ladakh without speaking the language, without living with the people, they assumed that it was an unjust system in terms of gender, because very often at festivals and gatherings, men and women would sit separately, and they would assume that this means somehow injustice to women. Well, it didn't. They also saw, and this is where it becomes trickier, is that generally, even at the village level and beyond that, in the formal economy, in other words, outside of the household economy, it was the men who tended to be the traders and to be the dominant voices. But it was after living there for years that I realized that almost all the important decisions were taken at the household level, and that the grannies and the aunties and the women had a very strong voice. Now, I would argue, having lived there for all those years, that the position of women and the feminine values and the nurturing instinct had far higher status than in Sweden, where I grew up. And Sweden has been held up as being one of the best places for women, because within the industrialized world, it is true that we had far stronger positions than in the Anglo world, for instance. But still, I would say nothing like the profound support of women, of mothering, of hearing their voices. And for that, you need very localized, strong systems and strong local economies. And that's really what all indigenous people had. Now, there might well be some indigenous cultures where this feminine and the women didn't have such a strong role and voice, but my sense is that in the majority they did. Just like they had that deep connection to Mother Earth, they had a deep sense of mother and the feminine. I remember in Mongolia hearing teenage boys singing songs with lyrics like, "Oh, mother, I love you, my mother, my mother. Your breast milk is like the glacial water from the glaciers. I forgot what else, but to hear words of adoration for mothers and her breast milk sung by teenage boys, it just tells you you're talking about a very different culture."
Thanks, Scotty. Dilip, would you like to open?
Haven't seen that in any pop music.
Hey, Scotty runs a community radio station. Maybe you need to be looking for some more of that kind of music, Scotty. That would be great. Thank you.
I'll do my best.
Dilip, go ahead, please.
Hi, thanks, Morag, and hello, Helena. Just want to check. Yes, hi. So I'm from Bangalore, India, right? So this is a big city, and around the city we have a lot of villages, and that's where I work and I kind of volunteer. It's something new, and I really like doing this. So what I've observed, I'm just telling you what I've observed. They do a lot of chemical farming, and which is what happens a lot here. They ask me, why do you come here, and then why do you want to farm? I say I want to get into this organic farming because that's the kind of food which I want to eat. But what you eat is just more of chemicals. And this is a lot of women over here. Okay, I work with a lot of women and even men too. So they work in the field, So that's what they ask. And I tell them, no, this is not really good for health, and this is not what I want to eat. And then we have a small space where I grow my own, organic food, just permaculture techniques and things like that. So what do you think that I can do to convince, or maybe support the entire city?
Yeah.
Yes.
For one thing, I would urge you to connect with Bumi. If you don't know about Bumi, it's a very important network in Bangalore. A close colleague of mine has a college there and a school, a green school. They have a farm. They're working in this direction. I would also suggest, and this is something that I think is not being done enough, and that is that bringing information about how in the Western world, in America, which is often looked up to as this sort of paradise and model of progress, how there are so many examples of people turning away from the chemicals, turning away from city life to want to go back to the land. That's a really important thing, because young people are psychologically pressured to create a sense of inferiority and backwardness about their own culture, their own practices. And any land-based, community-based institutions are seen as backward and primitive, and they're being made to feel inferior vis-a-vis the Western model. So to show that in the West, people are suffering from much higher levels of depression and anxiety than in India, even now, that there are very serious signs of problems in the West because of a system that takes us away from the land, away from community. And just as importantly, that there are people working in the opposite direction. You could look at a film we made called Paradise with Side Effects, where we showed how we used to take people from Ladakh and sometimes from India to the West to see with their own eyes that actually this paradise is not what they thought it was, and that people are longing for the deep connections to community, intergenerational community, and to nature. So that shifts the whole vision of progress.
Yeah.
I'm really happy that I spoke to you. You've given me a lot of ideas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dilip. I think what you just mentioned there, Helena, about rethinking progress is one of those key messages that keeps coming through your work consistently. I recognize we've got about 5 minutes left. I just wanted to note that there are an enormous amount of questions in the chat, and I'm not ignoring them. There are a number of questions that relate to how to revitalize a community garden, or to get projects going that have been, that have started then slowed down. And I'm thinking that possibly we can organize a second event later on where we can talk about that. Community gardens and city farms and projects like that have been something that I've been working on for decades, and I'd be absolutely delighted to explore that and bring in some other friends of mine too, who are part of the Community Gardens Network of Australia and other international organizations, to explole that. So let's put those on hold. The one question in here that I wanted to point to was, and I don't know whether it's a little bit of a difficult question to answer though, Helena, is there a model for local that can be a good blueprint to consider, like a local food system? So let me read it out. A local system requires an attitude and behavior, but is there a model? Like, is there kind of like a guide that exists? Is there something that can help people get started? A step-by-step guide, or is it something that can encourage people to do individually wherever they are?
Well, I would say that we don't realize the importance of human scale. So what I've found is that particularly when we set up farmers markets, the farmers who, as I told you, one said, you know, his whole life had been a farmer and they were being pressured by the market far away in the city to produce standard size and always pressured to produce more and more standard and at a lower and lower price. Suddenly in the farmers market, there was this completely different world. The coming together of consumers that actually weren't looking for standard size. Nowhere in the world are we doing that. We human beings are not driving the system. It's an inhuman system. So the amazing thing is that as people come together in more human scale, direct exchange, it's not that they become different people. You don't have to start by thinking that values have to change and that you have to have some kind of new cooperative structure, that you can't be looking at profit. It turns out that small local businesses that need to earn a bit of profit within more human scale relationships become more human and become more responsive to community values. You get a type of accountability and visibility which encourages more responsible, more ethical, more community-minded behavior. And I could go on and on about this because it's a really important thing. A lot of people now in the West are being brainwashed into believing that we're in this situation because we have such nasty values. We haven't listened to all this warning about climate change. We don't care. We're just driving our cars and it's our values, it's our greed, it's our desire to keep consuming that's running this system. It isn't. It's a corporate globalized system on automatic pilot, more than anything run by algorithms. And I'm not exaggerating. You can find in the official, just on ABC radio yesterday, I was hearing about CEOs using algorithms to decide, to take decisions. It's an inhuman large-scale system that doesn't allow for genuine individualism, doesn't allow for community feeling and care and cooperation. It's built on separation, speed, competition. So yeah, it's getting out of a mechanistic stranglehold into more human scale structures. And I think you'll see, I hope you'll see what I'm talking about.
Yeah. So starting small, starting with the local food feast, starting with around your kitchen table, thinking about ways you can connect. And once you start to connect with other groups, it begins to go out. Helena, there's a question in there about how do we get more of this kind of information? Where do we learn more about this? Well, you know, one of the things is coming to events like this. This is a great place, you know, like more and more masterclass, and I've seen lots of suggestions. We'll continue to do that. The permaculture courses that we run, absolutely. Helena has enormous amounts of resources on her website. Maybe just want to let people know what you've got there.
Well, localfutures.org, I do have to say, is probably, you know, in the whole world, there's no other organization that's been promoting localization for 40 years. And that's been doing it from a global perspective, from global experience. It's very important that it not be parochial, because then there's also a lot of propaganda about this being some kind of narrow, selfish Western thing. Once you have the bigger picture, you can really join this chorus of voices from a global perspective. So we have a lot of resources, including readings, including writers who wrote about indigenous culture before the whole dominant corporate system prevented us from having a positive view about corporate cultures as whole ways of living. Thank goodness there's a cultural turning and people are developing respect for indigenous, for the ecological, for the feminine. There is this huge cultural turning, but it's not enough. It needs to be accompanied by more understanding of the economic trajectory. So yeah, we have lots and lots of materials. As I mentioned, the localization action guide. And I wanted to say also about the blueprint, that for me, I feel so empowered to be encouraging localization precisely because it's not an ism to be imposed. It's not a model that can be used everywhere. The model is adapt to diversity. The truth is that life is diversity. Every seed, every plant, every leaf, every one of us, not only unique and different, but changing from moment to moment. That is life. That's the miracle of life. Localization is about adapting to that life instead of unconsciously imposing a standard mechanistic view of life. And that gets into, well, too much to say, but I hope you will look at our readings, at our books, at our films, and use them as educational tools.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Helena. And, you know, throughout our courses too, we're always encouraging people to take all of your materials and share them and weave them into their permaculture programs, because I think that's absolute essential in terms of the basis of what we talk about too. So it's now the top of the hour, and I know that Helena has a lot to prepare. She's going to go on a podcast soon, so we'll let you go. Thank you for taking the time to spend with us here today, Helena. It's been an absolute delight to have you.
Thanks, Morag.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for being here. I will organise another event again to follow up from this, so keep your eyes out on the emails that come through, and keep sending also ideas of what you would like to talk about more. That is why we hold these spaces, so that we can really pull apart different things that we need to do to be able to make the kind of difference and to bring forth the positive change that we want to see in the world. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Stacey, for being behind the scenes, letting everyone in and answering. And thank you for everyone who's been having a great conversation and answering each other's questions in the chat. I'm sorry I wasn't able to be in there chatting away. I just don't seem to be able to multitask, to be able to answer texts and host a conversation at the same time. But anyway, lovely to see you all. Hope you're staying well, and I look forward to catching up with you again at a future event. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Morag.
Bye.